This podcast was created to educate listeners on the experiences of diverse individuals. However, all opinions expressed by the host or guest do not reflect the overall standing of Tarleton Radio or Tarleton State University.
Hello everyone, welcome to Making Space, a Diversity Dialogue, and I am your host, Cole. This is a bi-weekly podcast where together we'll have questions answered about socially sensitive topics while learning how to create lasting relationships with diverse people. This episode is in honor of Women's History Month. We're going to be talking about women in politics, women in voting, and we actually have two expert guests this week. That was really fun for me to find out. I'm really glad to have them on. It is Dr. Jensen Branscombe and Dr. Marcy Reynolds. Now, Dr. Branscombe is an assistant professor here at Tarleton State University, and she has experience in U.S. immigration, women, gender, sexuality in the United States history, American Southwest borderlands, and modern United States history. And Dr. Reynolds teaches at Tarleton as well. She has expertise in American politics, interest groups, the judicial branch, and state and local government. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to them, and they can tell you how they gained this expertise and a little bit about themselves.
Okay, well, great. Thank you. I'm really delighted to be here. This is Jensen Branscombe. So, yeah, I teach history at Tarleton. I've been here for about 5 years. Most of what I teach are modern U.S. history classes, but I do have expertise and specialization in immigration history and women and gender and sexuality history. I sort of a long career path to get me to these interests, but I really developed, I would say, my interest in women's history specifically a little bit later, and it was when actually I left my undergraduate and just started paying attention to the world around me and noticing some different experiences that women were having, in the workplace, and in politics. And so when I went back to graduate school to study history more in depth, I started wanting to know a little bit more about the history of women, specifically in the United States. And so I included that in my study, and I'm really delighted to be able to teach those topics here at Tarleton.
That's great. Now, did you have personal experiences with those differences before you came to higher education, or did you just really start noticing after you graduated?
Well, I think I didn't really notice until I graduated with my BA in history, and I was applying for jobs, and I think I was interested in jobs that historically were maybe not considered women's work, right, or feminine, and that really started to get the gears rolling in terms of thinking about why do we even have these conceptions of women's work and men's work, and how challenging would it be for a woman to enter these predominantly male fields and vice versa. And, of course, education historically has been women's work, considered women's work, but there is a difference in higher education where, women are more associated with younger kids in that caretaking role.
Right, that nurturing nature.
And so I've had wonderful experiences through graduate school and working at Tarleton, but I do think these gender issues play a role in higher education.
Right, and these are all important. We'll get to those. And now we're going to hear from Dr. Reynolds. Go ahead.
All right, hi, I'm Marcy Reynolds, and this is my second year here at Tarleton State University. I work in the Government Legal Studies and Philosophy Department, and mostly teaching Texas government, federal government, and Introduction to Political Science classes. I have entered this profession. This is my second career, actually. I was a high school teacher before. So,
oh, really?
Yes, it wasn't a huge jump, but I taught government and became really excited through teaching government and learning more about the civil rights movement. That really intrigued me, and how it was evidence of democratic processes in our government to a certain degree. And so when I went to grad school, I decided I want to see if there is democracy in America. Yeah, that was my question. And
Okay.
so, yes, and so that led to my focusing in on interest groups and state and local governments and processes in those levels, and then also with the judicial branch and the decisions of the judicial branch, which had such an important effect on civil rights in this country and also democratic processes.
Great. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. I think we're going to change it up a little bit. Our past 2 episodes, we've kind of had a different structure, but this time we're going to go over vocabulary first. Now, I have a list, and I didn't know if you guys had any extra to add, but we're going to go ahead and go over the gender gap. Did one of you want to take that definition?
Okay, sure. All right. So the gender gap, the online definition, is a discrepancy between men and women in various endeavors, fields, etc. So I just took it as discrepancy between men and women and then applied a political lens to that.
Right.
Okay, good. So started out just basically, are there policy preferences that you could say are more gendered?
Okay.
Right. And studies have shown that there are a few issues that are of greater interest to women than men, or that women seem to focus on more than men. And those would include the role of government in policy areas such as education, healthcare, welfare, and gun control. So we have that kind of split between men and women paying more attention to those kinds of issues. However, I do want to add that with party polarization, it seems like the men and women within parties are tending to agree more on issues and how to resolve them. So you would have a greater distance inter-party. So women in the Republican Party versus women in the Democratic Party would have a wider distance in their policy preferences than within the Republican Party.
Okay.
Yes. And along that line, though, interestingly, women, since around the 1980s, have tended to vote more often for the Democratic candidate than the Republican candidate. And there's about a 10% difference in that how often they will vote for the Democratic over the Republican. And this is pretty consistent across racial demographics as well, with the women favoring the Democratic candidates. All right. And then finally, so that was gender gap with policy preferences, partisan identification, and then also I wanted to just briefly address political ambition, because there is a gender gap with political ambition.
Right. I feel like as recently we have gotten a lot more ambition from women to go after political roles. I mean, if we look at the presidential election or primaries that we're doing right now, there were quite a few women in that. I know Elizabeth Warren was one of the major ones. I find that really interesting. I'm glad that we're getting there. I just wonder where that was before.
Well, and if I can just interject,
Of course.
this is Jensen again. I think you're right, Ambition matters, but it's also about opportunity,
Of
right?
course.
Which I know we're going to get to,
Yes.
but I think it's not that just like previous
Right.
21st century women didn't want these positions.
Women had ambition.
So,
Women
yeah.
had ambition. It was just, was there a place that they were able to go with that?
Absolutely. That is it. Because there are institutional barriers to women advancing still. Yeah, it is a male-dominated venue when you're running a campaign or you're trying to find funders. Primarily, you're going to be working with men. There's been an exclusion of women, both formally and informally, in the smoke-filled rooms, etc. So there's just been this pattern of women being excluded from politics. Also, if you think about just incumbency, and not any kind of gender bias there on the outside, but
that inner thinking, what you've always grown up with.
Precisely. And the people who are in office get reelected time and time again. So this opportunity is limited, for women. So when there's an open seat, like in Congress, then you see more women coming out to run for those offices, right? Yeah. So women have been also somewhat reluctant to step into this gap just because of some of the social constraints that they are under. There's a perception that women candidates have to be more prepared, better qualified,
Right.
Possess leadership skills more consistently than men do. And so there's gendered patterns of socialization that affect the perception of candidates versus also women's roles. And so we see that women are often expected to fulfill domestic roles and spend time giving care to children and elderly relatives, that men do not have the same kind of
There's
expectation.
just this, I mean, and we're going back to the definition here, this gender gap between what we perceive males should be doing, even if it's not outwardly or loud spoken, versus what we perceive or have been taught that females should be doing.
Exactly. So gender gap can mean many things, right? And I like that you mentioned how more women seem to be running now, right? And especially in the 2018 election,
Right.
we saw a large increase in the amount of women running for office and winning. So
Yes, that was really nice.
Yeah.
All right, our next vocabulary term is going to be glass ceiling. I don't know if one of y'all wanted to take that one too. Oh,
I'll jump in.
Dr. Reynolds, you're like, yes, I have all of these answers.
Just these two. So the glass ceiling, again, just an online definition, it's an intangible barrier within a hierarchy that prevents women and minorities from advancing. So we've heard of the glass ceiling terminology for over 50 years.
I've heard it thrown around, and it was only recently that I really kind of understood what it was, and I always associated it with the workplace. But going to politics, how is it?
A very similar application as to the workplace then. Women can gain power to an extent, but it's limited. And so I'm going to go back to the workplace real quick.
Of course.
Just with that. Okay, good.
Yes.
And just thinking about 50 years ago, how different the work environment was then with work and or serving in Congress, just the difference between men and women. You know, now we have federal and state prohibitions on sexual harassment, which we didn't have back then. Now we have the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which we didn't have back then. So I really think that women have made advances in advancing towards the glass ceiling, but it's difficult to go further. I don't like Hillary Clinton,
Right.
You know, like getting into that top spot. Yes, and we see in Congress there's a plateau where about 25% of the members of Congress are women, and we don't see that changing much. You know, it fluctuates, but we haven't gained.
We don't see a large difference anymore. It's just stayed at the number of seats that are taken, and that's it.
Exactly. So in a way, that could be a glass ceiling. Now, you know, Nancy Pelosi, she's Speaker of the House, so we have retained that, and yet. As far as just representation and moving into these places where you have a seat at the table and you actually have some power, there seems to be some limitation there.
Right. There's some stagnance going on there.
And if I can add that, I think this glass, visualization is important because some of these restrictive laws that you mentioned, Marcy, earlier, they are gone, right? You can no longer discriminate on the basis of sex when it comes to work, right? You can no longer discriminate.
At least openly.
Right. Say that women have to look a certain way or weigh a certain way to have these positions. But exactly, Cole, what you're saying is that while we call it a glass ceiling, is that barrier is still there, but it's made more invisible, right? Because those more restrictive policies have been scrapped, right? But now we have these kind of de facto, right? Or like not all like that evident, right? That we're not going to give you that job because you're a woman. We're going to find other reasons to
maybe
to
you don't have this this particular skill or this level of experience, even if you have the same as other candidates. Right.
And we might be getting into this later on, but I did want to add, and this is relatively recent, actually, where you don't hear people looking at women and saying, oh, look at our women candidates for office. Look at her hair. You know, why isn't she wearing a skirt? I mean, that was in the 1990s. Reporters would focus more on women candidates and how they looked and what they wore more than their issues.
Yeah, that is incredibly interesting. I know we reached a point in political history where we had TV instead of radio, and it suddenly became more of a looks game and more of a popularity contest. Wow, that might have been a hot topic to say. Well, we went to more of what people looked like as to what they sounded like. So then, of course, you get to women who do have this perceived of, oh, she has to have a skirt over her knees, or don't show her collarbone, or etc.
Exactly.
That's a good point to bring up.
Right, and I think that does fit in with the definition that Dr. Branscombe gave us for the glass ceiling. Yeah.
All right, so our next one, and I wanted to make sure to put this on here because I know a lot of people hear the term and just see it in school textbooks, like, okay, but they don't really think about what it means, and that's going to be suffrage.
Right, so I'll address this one.
Yes.
And it is an important term.
It is.
And interesting because it sounds horrible, right? Oh, we want to end suffrage. That seems
Right.
bad. And I hear that every once in a while. But actually, suffrage quite simply just refers to the right to vote, right? It's the political franchise. And so part of the reason that I think it's important that we're talking about women in politics today is that this year is the 100-year anniversary of women getting the right to vote.
And that's going to be in August, right?
Yes.
Yes.
But right, of course, the campaign was much longer.
longer.
But we refer to that kind of conventionally as the women's suffrage movement. So it was about women specifically fighting for that political right to get the right to vote. But of course, other groups in American history and world history have had their suffrage movements to earn that.
When we think of it,
right.
we usually think women's suffrage.
Yeah, and in fact, to a lesser extent here, but certainly in England and Western Europe, these women's rights activists and their male supporters and allies would often call themselves suffragettes. Right? So it sort of became part of the lingo.
All right. Did you all have any other vocabulary terms you thought about?
If I could add one more.
Of course.
Because
I had a difficult time. I know with some of these topics, I am completely, all I'm doing is my own personal research. So if there's anything you guys could bring, that is amazing.
Well, the term I thought of, because it has historical significance, but also current relevance, is the term Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA. So I would imagine most people who are sort of familiar with these topics might associate the ERA with 1970s feminism, but it actually originates in the 1920s. And basically what the Equal Rights Amendment is a proposed amendment to the United States Constitution that would ban discrimination on the basis of sex. And it's pretty simple, right? That's pretty much the language. So it's originally proposed not long after women do get the right to vote, and it's a sign that this is a victory for women. It's not a complete victory, as I know we'll talk about, right? It leaves out a lot of non-white women, but it was something to be celebrated. But the fact that we move on pretty quickly to Alice Paul proposing the Equal Rights Amendment is a sign that there are other areas of life in American society where women are not yet equal to men. It doesn't gain a whole lot of traction in those first few decades after it's proposed, but then it does become another issue in the 1970s. And again, this is the era of the second wave feminist movement and women's liberationists who take this back up, and it actually does pass the United States Congress, but it fails to get the requisite number of states to ratify it, right? So I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but it sort of faded away again. There's actually a pretty strong resistance to the Equal Rights Amendment from a number of areas, but there are also women who opposed it. But I mentioned it's been in the news recently because just in January of this year, the 38th state, Virginia, voted to ratify the 38th Amendment. So we now have the number of states needed to ratify, but there's a little catch that we passed the initial 7-year deadline to do so. So this is kind of a current news item, and we'll see where it goes. But I think it's another kind of important term for people to be familiar, because our Constitution actually doesn't fully address sex other than specifying certain rights for men, I should say.
Right. I mean, there's reasons we have amendments in the Bill of Rights, and there are definitely certain things we need to add on as we grow as a people and as a nation. I think we're going to go into history now. We mentioned the women's suffrage movement, and that was from 1848 around there until 1920. Now that's not saying that there weren't women fighting for rights before that. That's just when it really kind of picks up and gets traction, and that's going to be because of the Women's Rights Convention, right? With Elizabeth Canton? No, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. There's a C in there. Sorry about that. And that was in Seneca Falls, New York. Is that how you pronounce that? Okay. Yes, with the Declaration of Sentiments. Did you guys want to add anything about that?
Well, I will just say, I mean, you're absolutely
Yes,
right. We that date is sort of pointed to as the beginning of what will become
this whole movement.
Yeah, right, this women's rights movement. But if you, and I do recommend listeners to look up the Declaration of Sentiments, because it's really quite fascinating, because it is sort of a recognition that since the founding of the United States and the Declaration of Independence, women had not been fully recognized as full and equal citizens. And I think sometimes, right, we forget that people, 100, 200 years ago sort of recognized, to a certain extent, some of the same injustices that we do today. So I would just add, right, it is a declaration that intentionally includes equality for men and women.
All right. I just wanted to note that also Elizabeth Stanton was the first woman to run for the House of Representatives in 1866. That is something I found that was really interesting. So this person, she really, really was gung-ho and did have that ambition like we were talking about earlier. And that was so long ago, but she was ready for it. She was ready for it to happen. Now, in 1869, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton founded the National Women's Suffrage Association. I didn't find too much about that, so do y'all have anything to say about it?
Well, it is considered, right, sort of the national and really the most significant women's suffrage organization. It certainly won't be the other one. And I do want to stress, maybe this is a good point, to recognize that, keep in mind from this transition from 1848 through where we are now in the 1860s and 70s, we've seen the abolition of slavery, the ratification of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which got rid of race, right? Or you can no longer use race, color, or previous condition of servitude when it came to voting rights. So, a lot of folks, we want to keep in mind that while we can admire and respect that the work that these women were doing, they certainly had some failings in terms of their tactics and leaving out non-white women by and large. This wasn't across the board, but this will certainly come to be kind of a shortcoming of the early 20th century women's suffrage movement. So there'll be others and other organizations that are important, but that's certainly one to know.
One to mention, right. Now I'm just going to run through a few names here of some firsts that women have done in this movement. So the first woman to run for president, Victoria Woodhull, in 1872 in the Equal Rights Party. And then we've got the first woman to be elected as mayor in 1887. That's Susan Salter in Kansas. And then the first three women elected to state legislature in 1894, and that's for Colorado House of Representatives, Clara Cressington, Carrie Hawley, and Frances Clock. And the first woman elected as state senator was in 1896 in Utah, and that's Martha Hughes Cannon. And I also wanted to mention the first woman elected to Congress as well, and for the House of Representatives in 1917 and to 1919, and then again from 1941 to 1942. Now, we kind of go through there. There's so many more people and so many more firsts within that list. I know I just ran through a few of them very quickly, but when we finally end that movement in a way. It's the 19th Amendment in 1920 gave women the right to vote. Now, that's... I remember there are some constrictions on that, correct?
You know, in terms of women voting?
Yes, women voting. I had seen around, but I was never able to get a clear answer that women had to be married to have the right to vote. No? No.
I imagine in some states they would pass laws like that. Yes, but not the federal level, perhaps. Yes,
Okay.
but within states, yes, I certainly can imagine that happening.
There's some sort of regulation to that.
Yeah. The 19th Amendment itself just is pretty simple, right?
Right.
Right to vote cannot be denied on the basis of sex.
Okay.
And there were, right, and Marcy's right to mention that there are state laws at work here, and actually some women in some states had the right to vote before 1920.
Right.
So
1920 was just that federal level of okay.
Right.
All right.
Right.
We've heard you now.
Right.
Right? We've heard you. We will say that you can vote.
Yeah. And so, and I would add then one of these restrictions at kind of the state level are, Jim Crow laws in the South. So
Right.
I mentioned the 15th Amendment, now we have the 19th Amendment. So according to the Constitution, right, all women, right, all people at this point should be able to vote. And yet we know the rates of African-American voting in the South, African-American women voting in the South, right? Those rates stay very low through the Civil Rights era. So I think that would be maybe one of the kind of restrictions you're talking
right.
about.
So that'd just be like the southern states using some sort of regulations, be it that you had to name all congressmen or something.
Yes, those are literacy tests. Yes.
Literacy tests.
Right.
If we're going to compare to African-American people. You could have a regulation for, you had to be married. Something like that.
And I did want to add, just here in Texas,
Of course.
because that's what I teach the most right now.
Yes, please.
Right, all right. In 1902, Texas instituted a poll tax, which was in place until 1966.
Wow.
So you had to vote. You had to pay
To vote.
to vote.
Interesting.
And they
I
would...
did not know that.
Yes, they would require you to pay in the winter, early spring, before your crops went in. So when your money was particularly dear to you, you were having to pay for your seeds and all the stuff that you needed to have a good crop. Instead of asking them to pay after the crops were brought in, they actually had some money prior to the general elections in November.
Right.
Right. So this was a law that particularly focuses people who were lower income. And you can imagine the formerly enslaved people.
Right. It would be particularly targeted that way.
Exactly, who were primarily sharecroppers and tenants here. So that was a law that Texas had on the books until 1966, 60 years. Now, something even more insidious, I think, in 1923, after women got the right to vote, Texas instituted, by state law, white primaries. So Texas is a one-party state, by and large, for most of its history. We transitioned from Democrat to Republican, but we've always been like a one-party state.
Right.
We were Democrat back then. And so the Democrats decided, the state law gave them power to limit people who participated in the primaries, which in effect would choose the candidate because the Democrat was going to win.
Right.
Yes. So they instituted the white primaries, which excluded, of course, African American and Latinos from voting. And in 1927, a Supreme Court case overturned the state law. So then the Texas Democratic Party said, okay, we won't make it a state law. It will just be a party policy. So the white primaries continued until 1944 with Smith v. Allwright, another Supreme Court decision that said, no, you can't do that. You just can't have white primaries.
Yes.
That is against all sorts of the constitutional
things,
amendments,
yes.
And interestingly, there is a county in Texas that decided to have jaybird primaries, or a pre-primary, where a group of people got together and voted on who should run in the primary. And these were limited to white people in the jaybird. And that was struck down in 1953. So basically, over 30 years, Texas had a white primary.
Right. It took a very long time for the southern states, specifically Texas,
Yes.
to try to keep up.
Exactly.
With equal rights.
Yes, and even after that was struck down in 1953, local communities would have slating committees. And so the powerful wheeler dealers, I guess, in the communities would get together and decide who they wanted to run for office. And then the money and the support would go behind those candidates.
Mm.
And if you weren't on that list, then you very likely were not elected.
Mm-hmm.
So the power remained at the top.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I wanted to mention that right after the 19th Amendment, the League of Women Voters was founded, and that was trying to get women to kind of rally and make sure they use their right to vote. Right? Am I correct on that one?
Yes, I mean this was, and I want to mention that League of Women Voters is still around today, and it's a great organization, and they are nonpartisan, and they do a great job ahead of every election putting out voter guides. So you don't have to be a woman, but I recommend this is one place to go just to get that information. But yeah, you definitely see the kind of the activism around women's political activism continue even after the vote, and the League of Women Voters and the Equal Rights Amendment are evidence of that.
All right, now after the 19th Amendment, I was just going to run through a few more names. The first Latina woman to be elected for a statewide office was in 1923, and I think that's pronounced Solad Shannon. And then the first Native American woman was elected or was in state legislature in 1924. That's Cora Bell Reynolds Anderson, elected to the Michigan State of House of Representatives. The first black woman elected, and there was a black woman who was appointed after her husband died before this, but the first black woman elected to state legislature was in 1938, and that was Crystal Bird Fawcett. And then that was for the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. And then we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That gave women of color the right to vote federally. It wasn't just for women, but that was something that we wanted to mention, and was written to overcome all state and local barriers for people of color. That's not just African American people, but Latino people, Asian people, all of that. So that was really, really important. And I think we talked a little bit before this section about what it's like nowadays in the political climate for women. But we have Hillary Clinton, we have Sharice Davis, Deb Haaland, I think, the first Native American women to be elected to Congress, and then Ilhan Omar, and I apologize if I'm messing up these names, Rahisha Tabad, the first Muslim woman to be elected to Congress. So that's really good. Do we have anything else to say about our recent years? Like, what does it look like? I know we mentioned that about 25% of Congress have women in them.
Correct.
And our House of Representatives. So we do have women representation, but we talked about that glass ceiling, that maybe we aren't going anywhere at this point.
And Cole, I would mention, too, because you talked about, of course, this very important Voting Rights Act, which has recently changed a bit by a Supreme Court decision in 2015, which has taken away some of the Voting Rights Act power. But, you know, in your earlier timeline, you mentioned the first woman to Congress was in 1917, Jeanette Rankin. The first black woman in Congress isn't until the 1960s, right? So again, I think you see that
big difference,
that gap, and that was Shirley Chisholm from New York. But I also wanted to mention her because she also is the first woman of color to run for the presidency in one of the major political parties, the two major parties in 1972. So, right, you mentioned some of these notable firsts, and we definitely want to recognize them.
Right.
But I think we should also recognize the women that, you know, put in the time and the effort to run these campaigns, which are just a ton of work and
it's
come
so
at
much
personal
work,
costs.
and a lot of emotional cost too. Because, I mean, even if you look at what's happening now. There's a lot of pushback from people to, like you say, Elizabeth Warren, as far as like, okay, that's never going to happen, or certain things like that. It's very difficult, I think, to be a woman in politics or be a woman in the face of such media. And it's very brave, I think.
I agree.
Agreed. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I was just thinking of Barbara Jordan in 1972.
Yes.
Yes. So that's Texas.
All right.
Yeah,
I think
from
we're
Texas.
I think we're gonna go ahead and we have a lot of questions this time around, so I think we're gonna go ahead and start on those. Now, this is the part of the podcast where we answer those tough questions. Now, we had kind of that general history and vocabulary overview, but there are a lot of questions that people have that we're like not sure who to ask them to, or not sure if they're really politically correct to ask, or something that has always been said to them that they really want to know the answers to. So that's what's going to go on here. Now, the first question I have is, why are women still considered a minority group right now? Even though they are such a large portion of the population.
Well,
right?
absolutely, yes. Over 50%.
Right.
Right, yes,
Right.
are women. And but the thing is, we're roughly equal in number to men, but they do qualify as a minority group because they tend to have less power and fewer privileges than men. So that puts them in that category.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, we talked about 25% of federal and state legislators are women, and women of color constitute about 9% of that number. So,
And that goes back to that gender gap idea, where
Right.
if you look at, certain professions and in politics, when since we're about equal, right, in society, you would expect
see
those
half of
Right.
the House to have
Exactly.
right,
women in it.
and some of that again might be personal choices and interests, but again that's connected to the glass ceiling and those other things,
and
that
then
we talked
connected
about.
to how we grow up
Absolutely.
and see ourselves as women, right?
Sort of-
Like, are we really pushed the way sons are pushed, for example?
Yeah.
Right.
Now, the second question is, why is it important for women to be in politics? I think we kind of explained that already, but what do you guys think? Why are women important to be in politics?
Representation is really important to me in thinking about different facets of representation. When you have your ideology, your policy preferences being represented at a decision-making table, you know you have a voice in government. So it's very important that we have diverse representation in our policy-making bodies in the United States at all levels of government. So I do think it's very important for women to be in politics, to give a voice to women's perspectives, women's experiences, women's attained wisdom that may not be there otherwise. So I think that's really important. And secondly, I wanted to kind of address what you were saying earlier too, is just women in office inspire other women to run for office. I mean, there are research studies that support this. So it's important to have those role models and those examples and those party leaders, perhaps, that will help you come up through the system and run for office and be engaged.
Right. You kind of have that inspiration as well as almost a confidence in knowing that, or a comfortableness with knowing that, okay, someone at least has my back, right?
Exactly.
And this is Jensen again. I would just add, right, all of the research shows that when you have a diverse group of people, they make better decisions. And that's not to say that, all women think alike. We could probably have a conversation,
come up in the
right?
question.
But, it's just, right, it's representation, but it's also from all of our different kinds of identities, we bring different ideas and different considerations to the table. So I think that's another reason to have women in the room. It's not that men don't think about women, don't care about stereotypical women's issues, but it's just that perspective and that life experience that we add to.
Now, this kind of goes into a question that was coming up next. Is it still valid for women to be in politics even if they don't value legislation or bills that support other women?
Yes. I mean, based on my previous response, yes, I think that is the case.
Agreed, completely. And, we need women in all parties, right? And so I think that's the main goal, is to increase the participation of women in the political arena, and not just relegate them into certain kind of demographic or stereotypical group. Okay, this is what a woman thinks, right? But we need to have lots of participation and diverse perspectives there at the table.
And just because they're it's hard in the realm of politics because, of course, we're talking about government and policies. But I think we also need to consider that just because someone doesn't necessarily support this particular bill doesn't mean they don't care about that issue. They might just have a different idea for a solution.
Yeah,
right.
So, politics is a very difficult realm in general, no matter if you're male or female or non-binary or whatever.
It still matters to have those voices in the room.
Right.
Absolutely. Yes. And I think we agree on a lot more than we think about, with this era of partisan polarization. There's some basic principles of government that everybody in America can agree on, like the importance of having representation, etc. And just how you approach different policies differs, and so that's where we get politics.
Right.
So,
Now, what would you advise people who are concerned about voting for women politicians? Like, I know there is some fear still in some voters about voting for a woman in politics, especially with the presidential election coming up. Is that going to count? Is that vote going to count for anything?
Yeah, the line.
It's a hard statement to say, but it's a lot of fear happening.
Yeah, and I agree, right? We hear this. I think the line I hear more often is someone might say, well, I don't have a problem electing a woman, or I wouldn't have a problem with a woman as president, but I don't think the rest of the country would, or I don't think my neighbor would, or I don't think my family members would. And it's hard to parse out the truth in that. But in terms of what I would say to that, these are tough things, because all voters are making calculations, because you want your person to win if you believe in them. But just speaking for myself, and I think others, if you heard Elizabeth Warren's speech this week when she withdrew from the race, she was sort of saying something along these lines, right? And that I do think it matters that you vote for the person that you believe in, and maybe that's idealistic, but I think that might help address this fear of what other people are going to do, because we don't know, right? You can know who you're voting for, right? The challenge, I think, comes with trying to filter out all of the noise, because sometimes it's the media and social media saying, like, oh, people are saying they might not want a woman, right? That you're going to waste your votes.
You're inundated with this information of concerns and fears all of the time.
And some of that's simple sexism and misogyny, but I recognize that's hard to do. But I think if you start with just hearing what the candidate has to say, going to their website and reviewing their policies, and if you find someone you like and they're a woman, try not to don't worry about, like, oh, other people might not like this, and I think that's the best thing that we can do if we want people we believe in, and we want to elect women, because we are hearing explicitly, right, in the Democratic primary now, that this has been the factor for some of those women candidates, that they had a lot of support, but then sometimes their supporters feared that they wouldn't get even more support.
Right. It's about changing a mindset. I think it really is, because we have, like, even women question, like, is this going to be enough, right? And I think you're correct. We just need to take the risk in order to gain the reward, or even to get partially to that. So that's important.
And ignore the noise.
Right, which is so difficult now that we have social media constantly around us.
Right. And I mentioned that study that they did in the late 1990s about what the appearance of the women candidates.
Right.
Well, they have followed up with another study more recently, and they find that just the professional journalism media outlets, like your newspapers or the large media outlets, will report more equitably on male and female candidates. So they're not seeing this disparity in how they're reporting on them. Now, issues.
good.
Yes, the same amount of time.
That's good.
But it becomes part of like the punditry and
It
the
does.
commentaries.
Yeah, it's just interesting that it wasn't that long ago that this was still happening.
Exactly.
1990s.
Right. But what
You don't think about that.
Yes, but social media, though, is now where
Yeah.
people get their news information more often than through these, like the local newspaper.
Right.
And
You don't go to a newspaper website all the time. You just have it on your phone, right?
That's true.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. But you also have these other voices through social media that don't have the kind of requirements or the journalism ethics
Right.
that you would see
The
in
code
other
of ethics
venues.
or the knowledge of how to find the correct resources, primary sources, secondary sources. all of
Right.
that.
Yeah. And one more thing I want to say to that question, too, is we use party cues when we vote.
Yes.
So I think hopefully we are at a point or moving closer to a point where it's the party label more than the gender of the candidate that will help us make our vote decisions.
I'm going to move on from some of the questions I have on the list because we've talked about them. What do you think is the most significant barrier in female leadership in politics or in general?
Okay. Well, I was going to talk about 3.
Okay, go for it. No. No, that's why we have you on here.
Because I couldn't decide. I mean, they're all important, but I think number 1 to me is institutional and just the male-dominated playing field. I think is very difficult for women to break into and feel comfortable in and feel like they are a part of. So I think I've already gone over that before, right? And then number 2 are these political perceptions on women, and it seems like a differential standard is being applied, whether it is or not.
Right.
That is what's being
that higher standard we think
precisely. Yes. So I think that can make women hesitant to make the effort, and then the systemic lack of equity in domestic duties. And how it falls predominantly on women to take care of families. And then finally, I just add this little note, a culture prizing traditionalism and gender norms can also make it difficult for women
Right.
to have
And
that support.
this wasn't in there, but just in case anyone doesn't know, gender norms are just what we associate with each gender. Like if a man goes off to work, makes the money, where women may do the cooking, the cleaning, the housework, taking care of the kids, that sort of thing.
Thank you.
I liked those. I really liked those, what you listed. All right. What are specifically women's issues? I know we hear that, like, okay, that's definitely, women are going to back that, or something or other. So what are those issues that we really see as quote-unquote women's issues?
Oftentimes you're going to see abortion and social welfare policies that do have to do with taking care of other people or addressing the needs of the poor, etc. So those are typically
Don't we have such a, like, I feel like there is a divide in those, even though they're considered women's issues.
Absolutely. And that is my point with this question. I had a hard time with that.
Oh, yes.
Because it is so contextual, too. And where do you live? Where were you raised? What kind of income level are you coming from? What has been your life experience? All of these go into thinking about those policy issues and how we would like to approach them, whether you're male or female, right?
So maybe we shouldn't have a consideration for women's versus male issues.
And I would agree with that, except when I think of some issues like abortion
that have to do with the body.
Exactly. Or even conscription for men. That's something that they have to do. Women don't have to do that as of now. So, these are specific issues that have to do with very personal matters. And so they should have at least listened to or considered the perspective of somebody who is going to affect.
Right.
So in that regard, I think, it is a woman's issue. Yes. But then again, when you look at politics, it seems like women in each political party are going to play to the party and act strategically. And so they're going to emphasize women's issues when it's good for their election chances. But then if it's not, then they're going to kind of toe the party line.
Okay. Our next question is, how do you think the current era of feminism has affected politics?
Well, this is Jensen. I'll jump in on this one. I do think, to the extent, the first thing that sort of pops into my mind when I hear this phrase, the current era of feminism, is younger women. And of course there are older feminists, right, from a little bit of an older generation. But I do think I do see a lot of enthusiasm and excitement among college students and young folks more generally, including women who, given the fact that we're in this Me Too era, right, where while most of these cases deal with the workplace and older women, I think maybe women in college are certainly aware and maybe have had these experiences. So I think, to the extent that feminism more generally, but especially younger women, are affecting politics, it's just to almost expect more representation, right, and more consideration of their issues, to be involved in the discussion, to expect, right, anytime there's a race, that women are going to be a part of that race.
And that's nice to have an expectation for that.
Right.
So if it's not there, then we say something.
Yeah.
But if it's expected, that's what we want. Is
right.
It not to be a difference and not to have to be a fight to get there.
And right, sort of the flip side of that also is that there's also an expectation that their interests and concerns will be addressed, whether it's a man or a woman, right? I mean, I'm thinking of going back a few years, but the sort of the last primary race where you saw a lot of young women really back Bernie Sanders over Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side. And they might or might not identify as a feminist, but sort of the expectation was, I'm not going to back Hillary just because she's a woman, right? I'm going to listen to those issues, and I'm going to expect this man, if he gets elected, to be considerate of the things that I care about. So, it's, to the extent that feminism is a little bit hard to pin down these days, it's much more diverse than historically we think of. But I definitely think feminism still matters, and there are still these issues of concern to women of all ages. But I do think that it looks a little bit different in practice when it comes to politics.
Interestingly, the millennial generation is highly engaged. Normally we see that, the people who don't turn out to vote are the young people. But it seems like those young people now, they're more attuned to politics.
It's what is also interesting is those, like, the tail end of millennial or the beginning of Gen Z, depending on what article you look at or what statistic you see. We see a big, hopefully at least a big spike in interest in politics now, and a lot more communication among parties, I think, in a younger crowd, more open to being like, well, I mean, I agree with this side and I agree with that side. We're trying to mesh together, And I like that.
You would have been the better person to ask about that one.
Now, what are the differences that we see women in politics here versus elsewhere, like around the world? I know we have some other women in politics, like in, I've forgotten now. I had it in my head. It's okay.
Well, pretty much everywhere in the world,
everywhere,
right?
Right. So what differences do you see there?
Well, I see that women have attained the highest offices in other countries of the world. Yes. And we are, I was trying to find it in my notes.
That's right, the Prime Minister.
Yeah,
right.
That's what I was thinking.
Oh, yeah.
There you go.
There you go.
The Prime Minister.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Yeah. And right now, the United States ranks 96th across all nations in the number of women in our national legislature. So,
why do you think that is? Like, why is America so far behind the one that's supposed to be so much more independent and equal?
Right. That's a good...
Well, and I will say...
don't mean to have so much sarcasm behind that, but...
Right, I mean, I'm assuming you're thinking of Theresa May or Margaret Thatcher, right, and Great Britain. But there are nations that maybe people wouldn't assume have had a woman as head of state. So I don't think it's just, we're an evolved democracy or anything like that. I mean, it's I think some of it is the way our system is set up has a lot to do with it. Would be my thought.
I was going institutions, systems, and perceptions. I think a lot of those things that we've been talking about, the glass ceiling, just the history of our country.
The culture that we were raised.
And the culture we were raised in, exactly. So how we address policies, how we have elections are all for a reason, right? And so there's some concern with elections now that the Shelby County Beholder case struck down some parts of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so we see that states are passing election laws that some people question, some people find discriminatory, and that are putting hurdles in place for certain populations to even go vote.
Yeah, and that just happened this week in Texas, where we sort of see the disparity and black and brown communities in terms of access to
polls,
voting, right, and the long lines,
days,
right, and all that sort of stuff is still very much.
Absolutely. Texas has closed over 700 polling places.
That's an incredible number.
It is an incredible number, and
especially for like Super Tuesday when everyone is supposed to be able to go.
Right? Some people in Houston waited over 4 hours to vote.
1 or 2 a.m. They were still standing in line.
It took me like 10 minutes here.
Right. Yes, it's handy, right, because we're a smaller community. But just think if you lived in an urban community or further out.
I mean, we had multiple different polling locations, and here, Stephenville, it's very small, and we still had a large amount of polling locations. It's incredible to think that there's none around it just because of these areas.
And, well, partially that has to do with new voting centers. So we've started creating these places where you can just go vote no matter what precinct you're in. Before that, you'd have to find out, okay, where's my precinct? Where am I?
Where do I have to go?
Yeah, exactly. And so there's a lot more infrastructure built into the election process. Now they're supposed to streamline it. The idea was to make it more efficient. You just go to one place. You don't have to worry about being in your precinct.
Definitely makes it easier for college students. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, think back to this question. Somewhat surprisingly, I do think we make it more difficult to get registered and to vote in this country than in other places, right?
Yes.
That this is much more of something that's available to you, and you sort of have to opt out of it. Where it's the opposite here. We have you have to actually put in the effort in order to be a part of
to get your voter's registration card.
So
make sure your address is still the same as it was 6 months ago or whatnot.
Exactly. And for students, you have to make the choice. Am I going to go back to my home district or am I going to make this my home district?
Right.
Yes. So that's a challenge.
So geographically, where are we seeing the most women in politics? And this, I guess, isn't federally, but where are we seeing the most women being elected and being recognized as leaderships in politics?
I would say in urban areas, and just the way the parties have evolved. Now the Democratic Party is much more welcoming to women, is much more promoting of women. They have established networks for women to use as they try to fundraise and get support for their campaigns, whereas on the Republican side, they don't have that as much.
I see.
So, yes, so if you see more women candidates coming up, it's usually through the Democratic Party.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so outside of the South, which is not
Which
largely Democratic, and that's not to say, of course, women aren't active and don't have positions here. We've seen races to the South where women were very pivotal, but you do see that in more Democratic and urban areas.
Exactly, yes. And I was just thinking of the judge positions that were overturned in Houston in the election of 2018. So in 2018, there were like 59 judge positions on the ballot. Big county.
Yes.
Lots of courts.
Yes.
Every single one of them was filled by a Democrat. And that included, and I was looking for the number, I think it was 19 black women judges, yes, were elected in 2018. So it was quite remarkable. Yes, that happened.
That is incredible.
Yeah. So I think, those areas, and then also areas that are used to more progressive policies, perhaps, and ideas, well, like the urban centers in the Midwest or the Northeast in California.
But that might be changing, too. I mean, again, I'm thinking, right, that these southern states are still largely Republican-dominated, but you think about the campaign for Doug Jones in Alabama, who replaced Jeff Sessions' Senate seat. Not to get too much in the weeds, but black women in particular were really credited with helping to get him elected. Stacey Abrams in Georgia, who ran for the governorship there, came very close, right? And of course, she's running in the Democratic Party, but we're talking about a state that's been very red for quite a long time, and so you are starting to see some of these candidates do very well, but also I don't want to forget the work of those voters who in some of these states, which I think we would include Texas, sometimes have an uphill battle, but they're putting in the effort.
And it's nice that we have the right to vote here, because it's very, very important. You're right. It's not only the campaigner's job to go out there and make sure people know his or her face or his or her name, party affiliation and all that, but it's the job of the voters to get them in there if we really care about them. Now, why is there a whole month dedicated to women's history? I wanted to bring this up because it is March, and so why is that? Why do you think that is?
I think it's a good question, because people wonder why we have these months set aside for various groups in our country. And I mean, specifically for women, I think it sort of comes down to the history of women being less recognized for their contributions. Again, I teach history, so really for much of the 20th century, women were left out of American history classes, and it's not because they weren't doing stuff and weren't important. We just didn't tell those stories. And so I think sort of coming out of this sort of rights revolution era of the 1960s and 1970s, there was a recognition that we need to recognize the contributions of sort of historically marginalized groups. So, of course, we have Black History Month and Hispanic Heritage Month.
There's Pride Month.
Pride Month, of course. And so this is just a way, not to say these people are better than anybody else, right, are special, or anybody who's not a woman, right, or not African American, or not in the LGBT community, right, don't deserve to be recognized for their work, but it's just the way that society has recognized them. So this does go back to the Jimmy Carter administration to start recognizing Women's History Month as a way to highlight women in history and their contributions. And even though it's been around for a few decades now, I think every March we hear these names and we hear stories of these women that people just don't know. And so I think it's still a good thing and still needed.
So it brings out of the shadows what people did, women did for so long before we can even think about it.
Right.
And it's like you learn it in grade school, elementary school, whichever, and it's like not something that really affects you as much. And then we have this month that's dedicated to it, and you're like, okay, it's incredibly important. And all of these names that I went through, there's so many more, and it's so hard to choose what's important when really all of it was an incredible step. And at the time, it felt like such a small step each way. But we've gotten to this point, and hopefully we'll get even further.
And Marcy said a little bit earlier, she talked about representation, and that matters. So if you're a young girl out there, and you're like, I want to go in science, I want to be an astronaut, I want to go into politics, but you don't know from your history classes or from the pop culture around you that women have done those things, it might discourage you. So here comes Women's History Month, and then you start hearing about these women who work for NASA and and had these roles, and it I think it then can help inspire people to recognize that, that person did it, I can too.
There's so many people in history backing you. You can go for it.
Exactly right. Yes.
Right. I wanted to ask, how do you think we can close this gap between the genders here in the United States, at least?
Okay, so in politics?
In politics,
okay,
yes.
Right. So I took that to mean have more women run, perhaps. Okay. Yes, because the more women we get out there, then the more women who are in those networks and able to assist and help along other women candidates, right? So I just said to support women candidates,
Right, it goes back to that question we had earlier about the voting.
Exactly, yeah. And actually maybe consider running for office, somebody.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think that's it's key, is one of the reasons why we don't have more women is because there's not more women running for offices. And so another way is to contribute to an organization like Emily's List. And Emily's List stands for Early Money is Like Yeast. And so you give money to the organization and they distribute it to female candidates.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, exactly. And then I put down in my notes, but we've already talked about, just as media consumers, try to get beyond all the noise and the punditry and just look at the candidate as candidates and what they're standing for, what they would like to do as political representatives.
Now, I think we're going to go to our final question. What advice do you have for women trying to get into this field or even voting? What advice do you guys have?
Well, I think it's critical to get involved with party leaders. Actually, you've got to run through the party system if you want to be successful. If you want to be elected, it's really important. Third-party candidates maybe sometimes get elected, but if you really want to get into office, have a seat at the table, you need to get elected. And party leaders have a lot of influence because they can help you, they can support you, they can encourage you, they can send funds around you to help you with your campaign. So it's important to get active in a political party at some level. Support a candidate, volunteer, and try to take leadership roles. Maybe be a delegate to a convention, get your name out there. Maybe you get to become one of the electoral college. So grow your own network and become involved with organizations. Let them know who you are, and then also on the other side of that, because women do shoulder a lot of the domestic chores, don't be afraid to ask for help. I know sometimes women don't feel like it's right for them to hire a maid. I should be able to take care of this myself,
right.
But I think you got to have a network professionally and also personally, exactly.
Have those resources available to you.
Right.
I know it's very difficult for me because I feel that weight of like, okay, I got to get the housework done, I have to get dishes and all this, but I also have, I'm graduating, I have a job here, I am doing all of these things, and I'm working to get my career started. It's hard to have those other responsibilities on top of all of that.
It really is. And when you're caring for another person, running for office, you might take a back seat for a while.
Right.
Yes. Right. And we see that women do that. They tend to step out of their careers temporarily or permanently once they have a family and they're taking care of their children. So,
I'll put in a quick little plug here for local politics. I mean, we talked today about the right to vote and how a lot of people in this country had to fight really hard to earn the right to vote, and yet we see year after year that we don't have huge voter turnouts, but local elections have the worst. So local politics matters, and I think in answer to this question, city council, school board, right? These positions matter. Not that national politics doesn't matter, right? But they almost can have a more important impact in our day-to-day lives, right? So maybe when you're trying to figure these things out and dip your toes in, start local. And same thing with voting, right? If, I don't know, maybe on a primary day or a presidential election day, you should still get out and vote, right? But when we talked about these challenges earlier, a lot of times these local elections that are sort of off year really matter. And if you get in the habit of voting whenever your city has an election, I think it's a way for you to get engaged. And now you're not only paying attention to these national issues, which again are important, but you're also more plugged into what's going on locally. And I think that can draw us into being politically engaged as well.
Right. Thank you guys so much for being on here. I think we're going to close us out. But thank you guys so much. We loved hearing from you. And maybe we'll have another women-specific episode either later this month, as it is March, or in the future, because I hope this podcast goes somewhere, right? All right, so we went over a lot of information. There are plenty of questions and answers, materials out there that we may not have covered. So if you'd like more information, you can send in something to the radio station's Facebook or Instagram. I run both of those, so I'll get your information. That's at the Planet 100.7. That's where you guys can get into contact with me. I'm also going to include some of the links to the resources I found in the description box below, and I'm probably going to get some sources from these guys as well. All right, and if you'd like to follow us for more updates about the podcast, maybe our next topic or next month's topic, again, make sure you follow us on Facebook, Instagram. We do also have a Twitter, the Planet 100.7 again. So thank you so much, and please join me next episode with a guest every week for those tough questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.